Okay, welcome everyone. Good morning for those of us who are, maybe in the US. So I welcome you to this webinar where we have the privilege to have Dr. Freter with us and Brother Shabazz on the issue of the superiority of race. Before I start, I'm just going to quickly introduce you to the network, the African Research Network. It's an organization that aims to bring academics working on Africa-related topics. Right now, I'm showing you our website where you can see, you can get more information. I'm not going to spend much time on this because our talk today is very interesting. So I just brief introduction to the network. So this is our website. And you can go and you can look at our past webinars. There you go. And also you can look at our future webinars as well. We also have a newsletter published every month in both French and English. And also you can also register on our website if you want to join us. That's just for the for our organization. And now let me introduce you to the to our guests. So Dr. Freter received his doctorate, his PhD with his thesis on facticity and existentiality in 2014 from the Free University in Berlin, Germany. He is now working as an independent scholar based in Knoxville, Tennessee, USA. His research fields include political philosophy, African philosophy, post-colonial philosophy, animal ethics, phenomenology of normativity, and literary studies. He is also an organizer of the forthcoming conference, Desuperiorization of Philosophy, to be held in August in 2019. Sorry, 2020. On the 11th and 12th of August. So it's happening very soon. And then our second guest is Brother Shabazz. Brother Shabazz is an independent scholar activist. He was born and raised in Los Angeles, USA. His adopted home is Ghana, West Africa, where he has recently traveled and spent the month of June 2021. He's an Harvard-trained anthropologist and has lectured in the field of Africana Black Studies since 2010. He has also taught sociology at several US prisons. Brother Shabazz's research interests include Pan-Africanism, Black nationalism, and Afrocentricity. I should also mention that Brother Shabazz served in the US Marine Corps during the Gulf War, and then he was honorably discharged in 1994. So that's just a brief introduction of our guests. Obviously, they have written a lot, and you can always feel free to ask if you want to the profile or the publication. You can ask us, and we'll be able to talk with them. So moving on to the presentation, I'm going to ask Dr. Emmanuel just to read the citation before giving Brother Shabazz the floor. Dr. Emmanuel, when you're ready.
Yeah, we are taking Dr. Bjorn Freter first, and you've read the citation, so we can go ahead.
Okay, thank you for that. So I'm giving the floor to Brother Shabazz.
We're taking.
Sorry.
Yeah, we'll take Dr. Freter first.
Oh yeah, okay, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah, please. Yeah. Yes. So I'm giving the floor to Dr. Freter first for his talk, and also feel free in the meantime you can drop questions in the chat. So you don't forget to, so you don't forget, so you can drop a question in the chat whilst Dr. Freter is speaking. Okay, you have the floor now. Thank you so much, Dr. Freter.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for the chance to being here today and discussing these matters with you. My presentation is mostly concerned with the situation I'm in right now, because I am from Germany, but I'm living in the US for some time now. And my presentation will be mostly concerned with the problem of race, or to be more specifically with white supremacy in the US. White supremacy is omnipresent in the US, even though it is consistently and firmly denied again and again. As the strange anti-slogan against the Black Lives Matter movement shows when it states all lives matters, white supremacy is invisible to most white lives. It might not be perceived by white lives neither as oppression executed nor as privilege experienced, or it is simply forcefully ignored. Whiteness, as Robin DiAngelo points out, is not acknowledged by white people, and the white reference point is assumed to be universal and it is imposed on everyone. Black inferiorization, in contrast, is glaringly visible. To Black lives, white supremacist racism, and that means Black inferiorization, is an inevitable component of every experience. Black lives have to be constantly aware that it is still up for debate whether their lives matter or not. Black lives in the United States are well aware that white lives matter, politically, socially, economically. Living while Black, on the other hand, means experiencing existential trepidation. The voicing of Black Lives Matter is not a banal statement of the obvious. Black Lives Matter is, unlike White Lives Matter, not a truism. Black Lives Matter, again, Black Lives Matter suggests, not for the first time, but yet again, that it is finally time to realize that the Black Lives Matter too. Black Lives Matter is precisely not pointing to the fact that lives matter, that all lives matter. Black Lives Matter is precisely not pointing to the fact that lives matter, but that all lives matter. By adding the signifier Black to lives, it is making obvious that certain lives are still not included among those who matter. A well-tended tradition since the Western Enlightenment in both Europe and America. It's necessary to say that Black Lives Matter because many white lives continue to not agree that Black Lives Matter, be it tacitly or more openly. Donald Trump as president, after the election of Donald Trump as president, that was glaringly shown. Instead of addressing white supremacy, Trump's White House issued on the 16th of June in 2020, 22 days after George Floyd was murdered by Derek Chauvin, a fact sheet that takes no action to secure Black bodies. In fact, it does not even primarily aim to protect white bodies, wanting instead to combat violence to protect the stone replicas of white bodies, namely the statues of white bodies. Donald J. Trump, it can be read in this fact sheet, is taking action to defend our nation's historical monuments, statues, and memorials. The document exudes white America's fear of unwhitening. It is a document of white extinction anxiety. The document goes on to state that the left-wing extremists are rioting, looting, calling for the destruction of the United States system of government through mob intimidation. These violent extremists are attempting to impose their ideology of the on the law-abiding citizens of this country. And finally, he gives some examples of what he calls senseless destruction, when he says mobs tore down statues of our founding fathers, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Trump's White House is not interested in the least in that which continues to happen to all the Black lives under the shadow of those statues of the slave owner, George Washington, or of the slave owner and slave rapist, Thomas Jefferson, in whom we find the most extensive and extreme formulation of the anti-Negro thought offered by any American in the 30 years after the Revolution. The adoration, even deification of this vicious anti-Black founding fathers will continue to catch up with Black lives and hold them hostage whatever they do. Each Black person using a $1, $2, $20, $50, or $100 bill is forced to look at the slave masters, Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, Grant, or Franklin. In a paradoxical sleight of hand, most contemporary American white lives do not present themselves as anti-racists. They live within a framework of an epistemology of ignorance, producing the ironic outcome that white lives will in general be unable to understand the world which they themselves have made. It's a vital part of white privilege to foster the ability to ignore the ways white racial identity has benefited white people. The epistemology of ignorance enables white lives to practice a specific form of pseudo-non-racism, which is usually called colorblind racism. And this colorblind racial ideology creates a facade of racial inclusion by suggesting that in the post-civil rights era, everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed. Thus, if a Black life fails to succeed, it is obvious that it must be a personal failure, not a consequence of the suppression. If there's a consistent theme in American racist thinking, as Wellman pointed out more than 40 years ago, it is to attribute the responsibility for inequality to the victim. The colorblind racists support racism by claiming not to be racist, while, and that's most important, not being anti-racist. And this, as a consequence, invalidates the experience of all those lives suffering from this racist pseudo-non-racism. Not only are Black bodies killed, this racism targets the Black experience and minds in general. What we see in the United States today is not only a gruesome, unceasing repetition of anti-Black homicides, but an ongoing century-old anti-Black epistemicide. And this is what Latrita Whiteman, the sister of Jacob Blake, who was shot by the police in the back of his in his back 7 times in front of his 3 children, remarked on August 25th of 2020, when she said, "So many people have reached out to me telling that they are sorry and that this happened to my family. Well, don't be sorry, because this is happening to my family for a long time, longer than I can account for. It happened to Emmett Till. Emmett Till is my family, Philando, Mike Brown, Sandra. This has been happening to my family, and I've shed tears for every single one of these people that it has happened to. This is nothing new. I'm not sad. I'm not sorry. I'm angry, and I'm tired. I haven't cried one time. I stopped crying years ago. I'm numb. I've been watching police murder people that look like me for years. I'm also a Black history minor. So not only have I been watching it in the 30 years that I've been on this planet, but I've been watching it for years before we were even alive. I'm not sad. I don't want your pity. I want change." Well, the 45th president of the United States did not want change. Everything is already fine, according to him. There seems no need to critically reflect and to do what Martin Luther King Jr. suggested 60 years ago, when he stated that a primary goal of a well-meaning administration should be a thorough examination of its own operations and the development of a rigorous program to wipe out immediately every vestige of federal support and sponsorship of discrimination. This is nowhere near to be found in the current, or in the, now to say in the, in the former administration. Let us remember when Trump stated that he was the least racist person that there's anywhere in the world. The hater-in-chief proclaimed his meritocratical non-racism, and thus, the hater-in-chief proclaimed his meritocratical non-racism, and thus remains, because he's not anti-racist, a colorblind racist par excellence. However, as Kendi explains, the claim of not racist neutrality is a mask for racism, and Trump is a prime example of that. And for someone like that, after all, the least racist person there's no need for change. And so, on September 17th, 2020, Trump lamented then, "Students in our universities are inundated with critical race theory, which is a Marxist doctrine holding that America is a wicked and racist nation, that even young children are complicit in oppression, and that our entire society must be radically transformed. Critical race theory is being forced into our children's schools, it's being imposed into the workplace trainings, and it's being deployed to rip apart friends, neighbors, and families." This is what the president said. So this is not what Trump wants. And he goes on to say that this is why I recently banned trainings in this prejudiced ideology from the federal government and banned it in the strongest manner possible. So Ms. Whiteman asked for change. And 23 days later, Mr. Trump's answer is, we can't let that happen. His vision of education in the US 2020 is, our youth will be taught to love America with all their heart and all their soul. That's a quote from Trump. That is, Trump's white youth will be taught to continue to proudly live with unearned privileges protected by systemic white supremacy. And Trump's black youth will be taught to continue to silently live with an undeserved lack of equality oppressed by systemic white supremacy while being taught that there is no such thing as white supremacy. Race is usually understood as an unfortunate matter of fact that cannot be changed. Americans believe in the reality of race, writes Ta-Nehisi Coates, as defined as a feature of the natural world. Racism, the need to ascribe bone-deep features to people and then humiliate, reduce, and destroy them, inevitably follows from this inalterable condition. But we should not be fooled. This is racism. This is racism, and it does not follow an alleged natural fact. This is indeed a fact, but a social phenomenon. Race, as Coates goes on to say, is the child of racism and not the father. The pseudo-natural factualness of race is a fiction. And this fiction is precisely what Trump expresses, that he wants children to be taught. For the white supremacist Donald Trump, education in sensu stricto is not needed. There's no need to learn critically to embrace the world. The world has already been sufficiently understood. All relevant questions have been answered. Or to put it more polemically, the youth of tomorrow can be handed a definitive dogmatic encyclopedia of what ought to be and what ought not to be. Now, all the answers are contained in there. They just need to be taught as an indisputable narrative and emotionally conflated with familial duty and faith. And one of the prime dogmas is love thy country. The simple combination of being white and not white supremacists in a society like the US is not possible. You can be either explicitly anti-racist or not anti-racist, namely racist. It is impossible to not be racist without being anti-racist, while being white, because the United States of America, our society, is so entrenched in racism that whether you want it or not, as a white person, you will have privileges that solely exist because of white supremacy. White lives think of racism as voluntary, intentional conduct done by allegedly horrible others. They seem to forget that white lives continue to be racist insofar as they benefit from the systemic white privilege. As a country founded for the most time governed by white supremacists, this country not only suffers from systemic racism, its system itself is racism. And there seems to be no part of life from schools to elections that is not influenced by white supremacy. White supremacy was used to being in charge for so long that it became a quasi-natural phenomenon. Saying Black Lives Matter disrupt this pseudo-naturalness of white supremacy. Being silent about white supremacy means to be complicit with white supremacy. It means to be a practical white supremacist, regardless of what your moral theory might be. There is no comfortable middle way. The only way out of racism, as suggested, for instance, by Kendi or Bonilla Silva, is anti-racism, active, practical anti-racism. And this step from the careless or apathetic white non-racist to an active anti-racist has not been taken by the white US or, in fact, by many Western people. Just think back. Slavery was certainly not abandoned because of a nationwide moral revolution that acknowledged that Black bodies were equal to white bodies. While Lincoln was certainly opposed to slavery, he was a pragmatic white supremacist in his concept of domestic race relations, but indulged a principled egalitarianism in this world outlook. Slavery was not abandoned because it was finally and widely understood and acknowledged as a moral failure. There was no deep society-wide practical or philosophical revolution in the West as a result of the Enlightenment, as foundational as it was for Europe or the US. In fact, the Enlightenment thinkers from Voltaire to Hume to Kant to Jefferson did not bring light to the prevailing racism. On the contrary, these thinkers helped to continue the anti-non-white, that is, racist course of things. They helped to create the illusion of the West as the moral authority while consuming coffee and sugar harvested by slaves and committing genocide of the native people of North America and Africa. Looking at white supremacy, looking at white history is uncomfortable. Looking at my white past is uncomfortable. That's just the way it is. I'm sorry. And it is the way it has to be. My white past is miserable. And should it be too much to ask of me or my fellow white people to endure this simple matter of fact, or for the sake of the world, I truly hope that that is not the case. We white lives have to overcome our non-racism, our acceptance of injustice, because we make ourselves believe that this is the way it is. We have to have a moral revolution. In the literal sense, we need to turn around and become anti-racist, and we need to desuperiorize ourselves. White lives need to learn that they are part of humanity and not its perfection. If there's anything in the world that can be called the white task, it is to unlearn, to unwarrant the implicit or explicit superiority of whiteness. And this is, by the way, not primarily a matter of knowledge. Indeed, it is not knowledge that is lacking. The educated general public has always largely known what outrages have been committed and what and are being committed in the name of progress, civilization, socialism, democracy, and the market. What is missing is the courage to understand what we know and draw conclusions from it, as Lindquist said. People of color who have been dehumanized by white lives have been able to rehumanize themselves. The world is waiting on white lives to finally desuperiorize themselves and overcome the adroitness in removing ourselves as a complicity in the problem of racism, and at the same time place the responsibility for alleviating oppression with the oppressed. White people need to rehumanize too, although not from having been dehumanized, but rather from the self-induced obsession of their superhumanization. White lives need to understand that they are human and just plain boring humans. We white people try to live in the sky, but we belong on Earth. We are not superhumans. The white dominion in the West is not because of our superhumanity, but because of our inhumanity. There's only one way out. White people need to de-superhumanize. And we need to find our endless privileges and unwant them, deny them, reject them. We need to learn that we're not superhumans, not the authoritative form of human, that we're simply not representative for human per se. And we white lives need to be thankful for that Black lives will give us the chance to do so. We need to be thankful, deeply thankful. We should take to the deepest corner of our heart what Kimberly Latrice Jones put in the most impressive and heartbreaking words, and I'm gonna cite her. You broke the contract when you killed us in the streets and didn't give a fuck. You broke the contract when for 400 years we played your game and built your wealth. You broke the contract when we built our wealth again by our own bootstraps in Tulsa, and you dropped bombs on us. When we built it in Rosewood and you came and slaughtered us, you broke the contract. So fuck your Target, fuck your Hall of Fame. Far as I'm concerned, they could burn this bitch down to the ground and it still wouldn't be enough. And they are lucky that what Black people are looking for is equality and not revenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very insightful presentation. I think Abiodun will want to do some just a summary.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Freter, for that insightful presentation. Some strong words were coming out from you, and I hope a lot of audience caught some of those concepts that the whites need to desuperiorize, and they also need to dehumanize. So Dr. Bjorn set out to address the incidence of white supremacy in the US, and obviously he read out interesting things that has to do with how the whites have attempted to suppress the Blacks. And of course, he made it clear that the agitation of Black lives is not about just Black lives, but it's about all lives, that all lives matter. And of course, he tried as much as possible to present the white supremacist agenda of Donald Trump and the very incidence of Black homicide and anti-Black epistemicide that has been the situation or the status quo in the US. One interesting concept that came up from Dr. Bjorn's presentation is that the incidence of racism in the US is not just the normal natural racism, but then it's gravitating towards a color-blind racism, just as he has made it clear to us. And of course, he challenged the incidence of white supremacists and advise or perhaps suggest that the whites need to understand that there is a need for them to dehumanize themselves, knowing fully well that they are at this very position, not because they were the best of humans, but because of the inhumane treatment that they have meted out to the Blacks. Of course, perhaps, let me just put it this way, the idea of elective ethics that Dr. Bjorn has been presenting were very much captured in this insightful presentation. And I hope that the audience will be preparing their questions after we have heard from hear from the second speaker. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Abidin, for the quick recap. Just for those who are joining us now, thank you for that. So we're going to, as I said, you could feel free to type your question in the chat as our speaker are giving the talk, and feel free to type your question in the chat. So now I'm going to quickly give the floor to Brother Shabazz, who is going to talk to us about give us the second presentation. Okay, Brother Shabazz, when you're ready.
You're muted.
You are muted.
Okay, got it now. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I'm ready now.
Yeah.
Do you have my slides? I just sent them by email to Augustine.
Okay, 1 second.
Yes, I could pull that up, but that would give me some minutes.
Okay, no problem. I can.
Dr. Freter for that presentation. I'm very sure if I have questions of my own, and I'm very sure a lot of people have their own questions too. So we go straight to the next speaker, Brother Shabazz, who is an independent scholar activist. He was born and raised in Los Angeles, USA. His adopted home is Ghana, West Africa, and he recently traveled and spent the month of June 2021 there. He's a Harvard-trained anthropologist and has lectured in the field of Africana / Black studies since 2010. He has also taught sociology at several US prisons. Brother Shabazz's research interests include Pan-Africanism, Black nationalism, and Afrocentricity. Brother Shabazz served in the United States Marine Corps during the Gulf War. He was honorably discharged in 1994. Could you please make welcome Brother Shabazz for his talk?
Greetings. So while the slides are getting set up, I'll just go ahead and start. I titled my talk, You're Better Than the White Man. Subtitle, Why Africans Need proper propaganda. And so I was invited to talk about white supremacy and ideas about superiority and inferiority and why those ideas persist and how propaganda has perpetuated those ideas. And so I wanted to start with a story. I have a friend in Legon. Legon is a suburb of Accra in Ghana. And I was in Ghana, this was about around 1998 or so. And my friend was about early 20s at the time. And he was inspired by African Americans and Jamaicans in Ghana who would wear cowrie shells, like the shells I'm wearing now. Can you guys see me okay? Yeah, so the cowrie shells. He was inspired by African Americans and Jamaicans and the cowrie shells, and he decided to buy some cowrie shells to wear on his own. And so my friend, who's Ghanaian, purchased an anklet, a cowrie shell anklet, and he wore that for about a week, maybe 2 weeks or so. And at some point, he stopped wearing the cowrie shells. And one day I asked him about the shells, and he said, well, you know, Brother Shabazz, I had to stop wearing them because my parents in my community, my church community, took issue with the cowrie shells. They believe that the shells are associated with Satanism, sort of satanic, and because it's satanic and unchristian, I had to stop wearing them. Now, the point of that story is how propaganda, in this case, religious propaganda, and I define propaganda basically as the methods by which people, a group, propagates its ideology as normative. So in this case, Europeans have used Christianity in Africa to turn things upside down, as it were. That things associated with African spirituality, like cowries, I wear cowries for protection. But for Africans now, for many Africans, and certainly for Ghanaians, and he's evangelical, I should note, cowrie shells are now negative. They're associated with Satan and evil and bad. And that's pretty much the story of how whites have used Christianity and how Arabs have used Islam to convince Africans, to compel Africans to reject their own culture and embrace foreign ideas. Now, a second story is about actually a book. There's a scholar by the name of Saidiya Hartman who traveled to Ghana basically to trace the trade routes and write a book about what she discovered about her data. And so she was in Ghana, and she spent this time in Ghana. She wrote the book, and in the book she has an interesting section on what she calls blood cowries. And so she goes into lots of detail about how cowries were used as an exchange for slaves. So you could buy an African. So white people would use cowries, not only cowries, but sometimes cowries, to buy enslaved Africans. And so she calls cowries blood cowries. And so again, you have a negative connotation to something that's really essential to African culture. On the one hand, there's a religious idea. It's been reduced to a religious symbol of evil. And on the other hand, it's been reduced to slavery, right? And this is pretty much how white supremacy has worked. It's made us reject our symbols and deem them negative. Now, what that does, of course, it allows us to forget or to ignore the fact that cowries, before they were even currency in Africa, they were used for divination. So it's believed for many African people that cowries have sacred power. They're oracles, and so they're sort of they're a way of bridging the mundane world that we live in with the spirit world. And we use the cowries as a way of communicating with the gods and the ancestors. And so all that vibrancy, that significance is reduced to blood cowries and Satanism. And so I want to move now to, and so that the point there is that Christianity has been used to subvert, undermine, negate African culture. Now, but it's also true that, can you go to the next slide, please? It's also true that African people have used Christianity and Islam to challenge white supremacy, right? So they've used it subversively. So, for example, Malcolm X. Malcolm X was a Muslim, and you'll see the slide, hopefully, if we get it up. Malcolm X was a Muslim, and African Americans since the 1930s have been, a subset of us at least, since the 1930s have embraced Islam, or a particular brand of Islam, to challenge Christianity as a white supremacist racist religion, and to assert our dignity, our humanity, our right to self-determination. And Islam was a vehicle for that, right? And as you all know, Malcolm X, or maybe you don't know, Malcolm X was, he was in prison from 1946 to 1952. As soon as he was released from prison, he was recruited to the Nation of Islam by his siblings while he was in prison. And so immediately upon being released from prison, he joined the Nation of Islam and became a prominent minister within the nation. And then there was a fast forward to 1963 or so, he was suspended for making comments about Kennedy. At the time, President Kennedy, who was John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated, and he was suspended from the nation. And within about a year or so, he decided that, well, it's clear that my suspension is going to be permanent. And so in 1964, he announced his break with the Nation of Islam and embraced Orthodox Islam, Sunni Islam. And then subsequently in 1965, he was assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam. Now there's a longer sad story I can't get into now. But the point of it is that Malcolm, when he broke with the nation, he said that, the nation did lots of good things and they did lots of bad things, but it came to a point where the bad was outweighing the good. But I do want to highlight some of the good. So for example, my friend in Ghana who had the cowrie shells, his father was inspired by Minister Louis Farrakhan. So there are people in Ghana who are inspired by Farrakhan. And so Farrakhan inspired his father to build lodging on his compound, these rooms on his compound to rent out. And so a big message within the nation is do for self, that Black people shouldn't wait on the government to do for them, they should try to do something, be independent of the government, generate income, do something for your people. And so he was inspired by the Nation of Islam to build these lodges at his home to secure extra income. And so there was some good done by the nation also. Some of it was good, some of it was bad, but Malcolm eventually broke with the nation and embraced Sunni Islam. Now, the thesis of my paper today, or my talk today, is that, I'll go back to the Malcolm X slide, please. The thesis of my talk today is that we have been slow to realize that the slave trade was not a slave trade at all. The slave trade was an act of war. And in our failure to not recognize the so-called slave trade as war, we have not been clear about what has happened in the past and what our circumstances are today and what we should be doing to combat this thing that we're combating. So by calling this thing the slave trade, we've confused ourselves in terms of how to respond, how we should organize ourselves, and what we should be doing to combat this issue. Now, having said that, so what is the response? I'm arguing that the response we have to have is proper propaganda. We have to we have to propagandize the idea that Africans are Africans are united, despite that there's more that unites us than separates us. That African culture is not inferior to European culture. That the things we do organically as Africans, including religion, are not subordinate to Christianity or Islam. And until we do that, we will remain second-class citizens within a system that continues to dominate us. All right, so my talk will be divided into 3 parts. The first part, I'm going to talk about the myth of the slave trade. Section 2, I'm going to talk about the myth of race. And then in section 3, I'm going to talk about the myth of science. And then in the conclusion, I'm going to give some suggestions about how we might move forward to get out of this mess that we're in. Sorry, my computer went down. Give me a moment here. All right. So section 1, the race myth. Now, we have to back up just a bit. And do you have a slide about the evolution of man or evolution of humankind in Africa? Is that slide there? I think it's the next slide. Okay, I deleted it. That's okay. That's fine. That's fine. Go back. The basic point is that we know that human beings or modern humans. There you go. Out of Africa. Yes. Go back to that. Out of Africa. No, the other way. Yeah. So human beings evolved first in Africa in about 200,000 years ago, right? And then there was an out-migration about 125,000 years ago. And so that's significant. And that core idea about humankind, civilization, science, religion, all of the things we think about as civilized actually originates with the first humans. And that has to, I think, figure more prominently in how we teach Africa, how we teach Africans to ourselves, to our students, et cetera. It should be more prominent in what we do. So that's a significant thing that we don't talk about enough. So civilization actually starts with African people. Now the question is, well, if that's true, then how did we go from being the original people to being subordinate, and not only being subordinate to being last, right? So all over the world, Africans are denigrated. How do we go from being the first to being last? And I'm arguing that the primary way that's been done is through propaganda, white supremacy. And so we have to counter that propaganda with, again, proper propaganda. Now, alongside of the idea that we're one human race that evolved in Africa, there's also race theory. Now, race theory was, according to the conventional explanation, developed in the 15th century, and the idea is that there are racial types, and that your intelligence, your ranking in the world is determined by your physical character, your physical features. And in that ranking of that typology, racial typology of peoples, it's no surprise that because Europeans invented this racial typology, people who look European were at the top, and people who look less European were ranked lower. And the people who were deemed utterly different from Europeans were at the bottom. And that turned out to be Africans, right? And so you have these racial types, race theory, that propagates the idea that people who look European are superior, and people who look less European are inferior, and Africans tend to be at the bottom because they look the least like Africans or Europeans. And so that's the idea of white supremacy. And so now there are different debates about when these ideas about race evolved. Some say it actually was before the 1400s. Some scholars argue that the ancient Greeks might be a place to look for these ideas about race developing. Others say no. So there's a debate about where it begins and where it started, but that's not the main point. The main point is that these ideas about race have become fixed. And whether you're African or European or Asian, much of the world imagines or sees the world, sees each other, and we see ourselves on racial terms. And so this idea, and I should note too that modern day science now rejects race. Race is not scientific. So we say, academics say that race is not a science, it's not scientific, but it's a social fact, which is to say it has meaning in the social world, but you can't divide up people in discrete categories by race. There's too much overlap, right? So scientists, well, I should know too that the medical science is the one holdout. So medical science believes that there's still something useful about racial categories. But for the main part, scientists have rejected the idea of race. But in the social world, race is still very meaningful. And it continues to determine the outcomes of people all over the world. Currently in the world, white people dominate economically, dominate politically, and Africans are at the bottom economically and politically, and we're exploited. And a lot of that goes back to slavery and the evolution of racial types that have become fixed. Now, it's also true that there have been individual Europeans who have kind of gone against the grain and they've given an honest reckoning of historical circumstances. Do you have the slide about Count Volney? Next slide. Oh, I'm going to go back. Continue. Next slide. Yeah, continue. Well, let's stop here. I wanted to note also that alongside of these racial ideas are racist ideas about the African phenotype. So Africans were associated with animals, with apes. And this idea about Africans looking like monkeys or gorillas is still very pervasive in the world, right? And so you see these images of Michelle Obama, Barack Obama superimposed over apes. And if you're soccer fans or football fans, right, you have people throwing banana peels out on the stage. And so these ideas are very prominent. And also measuring the skull to sort of prove scientifically, quote unquote, that there are different racial types. So these are all, and I should note lastly, in this section, Rwanda. So Rwanda is very much about racial types. There's a history of race making in Rwanda, starting with the Belgians. And what the Belgians did is that they would measure the skulls of Rwandans, issue out identification cards, and also favor the one group over another. So they would favor the Tutsis over the Hutu. And over time, gradually, the local people start to internalize these ideas about difference, that the Hutus are utterly different from the Tutsis, and also that we are, not only are we different, but we're enemies. Now, I'm not saying that Europeans invented this difference. I'm saying that they exacerbated it and made it sort of entrenched. And that's what happened in Rwanda. And so these ideas about race become very entrenched in Rwanda, to the degree that you have a genocide based upon the belief that your neighbor is utterly different from you, and that he or she is against you, and that you have to kill him before he kills you. At the seed of that, let's see, at the base of those ideas are racial ideas about difference. It was also there was also this propaganda about the Tutsis actually being Caucasians, right? And that went along with the idea that the Tutsis were superior to the Hutus. The Hutus supposedly looked more stereotypically African, and the Tutsis were tall and slender and angular, and therefore they were Caucasoids and therefore superior. And in fact, when I was in grad school at UCLA, as an undergraduate, my first day of a class with the professor named Merrick Poznansky, who's retired now. He used to teach in Ghana also. The first day of class, we were talking about ancient Egypt, and Professor Poznansky made the comment that the ancient Egyptians were Caucasoids. Now, of course, I had a problem with that, and so I was an undergrad, and I knew that didn't make sense to me, and so we argued back and forth for about 20 minutes, and then after the class, Professor Poznansky suggested that this class is probably not for you. Why don't you look into getting another class? And so that was that. I was informally kicked out of the class, but the point is that these ideas about racial types and types being fixed in intelligence are very pervasive. And in that case, Egypt is a problem because, this slide here, right? So Egypt is important because, if Africans are inferior, you have a problem because, Egypt has this long, continuous 2,000-year civilization. And how do you explain that? Because Egypt's in Africa. Well, the explanation was that Egyptians were white Black people. And this idea was propagated by many Western scholars, including Carlton Coombs, a professor at Harvard. And he was teaching at Harvard up until the 1970s, right? And so you can imagine he's influenced lots of students of his with these racist ideas about Caucasian Africans. So these ideas about race are pervasive, they're ongoing, and they influence how we think today, and they very much shape, or they very much have determined the plight of African people. All right. Now, I also wanted to mention a few more things in this section. One is Africans. Africans have also embraced these ideas. For example, you'll see conversation about the Fulani in Nigeria. And some Nigerians believe that the Fulani are so utterly different from us that they can't assimilate into the nation. They should go elsewhere. Some of it is based upon their mode of production, their itinerant, they move around. Some of it is based upon physical features. Some of it is based upon the claim that they're quote unquote from the Nilo-Saharan group and therefore not like the rest of us. But there's a part of that idea is racial. Now it's also true that, for example, Africans in Nigeria and Congo, Ghana, all over Africa, really, there's a problem with Senegal. There's a problem with skin lightening. And skin lightening is a complicated story, but it's in part about racial ideas and about the ideal complexion being a complexion that's not dark. So not necessarily looking like a white person, but it's certainly about being lighter. And so skin lightening is very much informed by ideas about race. And as you know, skin lightening is extremely harmful to the skin. It's unhealthy. And so these ideas, again, are very harmful. Last, I wanted to mention for African Americans. I'm from the U.S. In the U.S., we've adopted, well, in fact, it was imposed around the 1700s or so, something called the one-drop rule. And the one-drop rule said that any discernible trace of African ancestry made you Black. And that's the one-drop rule, right? So It doesn't matter. So there is an idea about physical features, but even someone who looks white, quote unquote, if they find out, if it's discerned, if it's found out, or if it's discovered, if it was discovered that you had a European ancestor, you were no longer in the white category. And so, for example, Malcolm X's mother's mother, or Malcolm X's maternal grandmother, was raped by a white man. And so Malcolm X's mother could pass for white. And so when his father was killed by white people, he was lynched, his father, Earl Little, his mother, Louise Little, went to work in houses pretending to be a white person. But inevitably they will find out about, she has this black family and put two and two together and figure out that she was actually black, or that she had black ancestors. And so she'd be immediately fired from her job. Right. And so that's how it may seem weird to outsiders, but it's very much a reality of African Americans that this one drop rule, it doesn't seem logical or reasonable, but the idea for the Europeans, for British Europeans, is that they had to keep the white category pure, and they are also distrustful of mixed race people, and so they put them all in one black category. Now, the interesting thing about that is the one drop rule was only applied in North America. In the rest of the Americas, it was sort of the opposite, because you had the dominant Europeans there with Spanish and Portuguese and French, and they did more race mixing. They were less interested in policing the divide between white and black. And so in the rest of the Americas, you have the sort of opposite of the one drop rule, which is to say that any discernible trace of European ancestry didn't make you white, but it made you non-black. And as a non-black person, you have a scale of racial categories that go from white to black. And so you have maybe 30, 40, 50 categories between white and black. So it's a very complicated way of reckoning racial categories. So in the US, you tend to have either white or you're black, but in the rest of the Americas, you can have 30, 40 or more categories between white and black. So it's a very complex. So the racial system is quite complex around the world. A Ghanaian's understanding of race won't be the same as an African American's understanding of race, won't be the same as an Afro-Brazilian's understanding of race. Although there'll be some overlap, there'll be some important distinctions. And then it becomes more complicated when a Ghanaian or a Nigerian comes to the US, or they go to Brazil, and they have to readjust. All right, so that's that section. Now, it's not to say that it's only that Europeans have imposed ideas about race on African people. Africans also have developed their own outlook on race too. For example, in Ghana, the Ewe call white people Ayevu. And Ayevu means tricky dog. It means tricky dog. And so they have an idea about race and about white people that's organic to their experience. Marimba Ani, who's an African-American scholar, has written a book called Yurugu, and she argues that white people are incomplete beings, and she calls those incomplete beings Yurugu. And Yurugu is a word from the Dogon of Mali, and it's a folklore. It's a myth. They talk about human development and how one line of human development was incomplete because they were too anxious to come out into the world. And she says, and she uses the Yurugu myth to understand white behavior. And so she calls him Yurugu. Francis Kweswasi, who's the author of the ISIS paper, says that white supremacy is a response to the fear of genetic annihilation. That is to say that her belief that the white genes, the white genotype is dominant, and the black genotype is dominant, the white genotype is subordinate or not dominant or recessive. And therefore, because whites fear of being eliminated by the white gene, by reproduction, they have to protect they have to protect their whiteness. And so she says that's a fear of genetic annihilation, and that's why they do what they do. And there are many other theories. In the Nation of Islam, of which Malcolm was a member, the nation taught that white people were devils. They were inherently evil. So Africans have also had their own ideas about race and difference, but the distinction is that European ideas about race and distinction are backed by power. Their ideas are, they can impose their ideas, and they have imposed their ideas on the entire planet, right? So it's not necessarily, it's not bad to say that white people are tricky dogs. It's bad when you impose that idea upon white people and then subordinate them. It's normal to have ethnocentric ideas about you being superior and the outgroup being inferior, but when you use that idea to subjugate other people around the planet, then it's a problem. And that's essentially what white supremacy is. It's ethnocentrism plus power plus the desire to subjugate. But the ethnocentric part is normal, but it becomes unnormal or it becomes pathological when you use that to justify annihilating people, committing genocide, dominating people all over the planet. Colonialism, imperialism, etc., are rationalized by imperialism or by the ethnocentric idea of white supremacy. All right, section 2. How am I doing on time?
I think if you can run up in the next 5 minutes, that would be great. So okay, we have time for questions.
Okay, section 2. I'll just go through this quickly. This idea that this thing we call the slave trade was not a slave trade at all. It was a war. And we know it was a war because if you look at the documents called, there are many different legal documents, but one document was called, one set of documents was called the Papal Bulls that were decreed. These were decrees or contracts by the Pope that sort of gave instructions to European explorers. And in those Papal Bulls, it says that anybody who's not Christian is your property, and anything that their land is your land, and that they're subordinate to you, and that you have the right to enslave them. And so they set sail from Europe with these legal documents justifying the subjugation of non-European people, right? So this was not really this wasn't about trade. This is about, from the very beginning, about Europeans going out and dominating the world in competition, I might add, with Arabs. They're fighting over trade routes. And so this is not, so mistrade is a misnomer. In fact, it's propaganda. It's propaganda that even African people reproduce, right? And in reproducing it, we undermine or distort our understanding of what's actually happening. We're confused about what's going on. We're confused about the history of how we got to where we are. And we're confused about where we get to go because we continue to call this thing a trade when it was in fact an act of war. Now, there have been some scholars who weighed in on this, but I can't get into all of it. But I did want to mention at least Oyerunke Oyeomi, who's a Nigerian or Yoruba scholar, who's talked about, she says that African scholars tend to start the problem with the Berlin Conference. And she's arguing that you miss a lot of the sort of the foundation when you don't connect the Berlin Conference, the colonialism, with the slave trade that happened, going back to the 1500s. And so she says, and I agree with her, that you have to draw an intellectual bridge between the slave trade and then track that on down to how that leads up to colonialism. And so African scholars, she says, and I agree, that they're missing a big chunk of the story by focusing or starting the problem or the issue with the Berlin Conference and the division of Africa, the partitioning of Africa amongst Europeans and Germany in 1884, 1885. There's actually a much older history that you have to reckon with to understand the Berlin Conference. All right, so I'll move quickly to and summarize the last section, section 3, the myth of science. So the myth of science is the idea that, well, in the Western world, knowledge was primarily religious, or religious knowledge was dominance. That was a primary mode of knowing, was through religion. And then during the French, oh, I'm losing my train of thought. The French, somebody help me out. Well, it'll come to me. So there's a shift in Europe from religion to science as knowledge, right? And in that shift, what Europeans have done is they separated the sacred religious knowledge from scientific knowledge. Religion is no longer deemed a legitimate way of knowing things, right? And so in that process, they've separated science from religion and made science an idea about being an objective knower, of being able to retest a hypothesis over, or retest an observation over and over again, of being separated from the thing that you're knowing, that you're thinking, that you're observing, right? And what I'm arguing is that Africans produce scientific knowledge without separating the two. And in fact, what Europeans have done is that they've removed an important and significant understanding of the world, of science, right? That science, I'm arguing that what Africans call religion is really a surface level understanding of science. It's empirical. It's based upon observation, but you have to get beneath the surface of the religious symbols to get to the science. And what Europeans have done is dismiss the religious part altogether. And I'm saying so colonialism and slavery have subjugated African understandings of science, and not just African understandings of science, all other non-Western understandings of science, and imposed a European understanding of science that separates sacred knowledge from scientific knowledge. Now, I work with Voodooists in Ghana who know this, understand this intuitively, and so to challenge this idea, these Voodooists in Ghana call their leaders, they call them priest scientists, right? Priest scientists, to make the observation that our religious system, our sacred system, is also scientific. It's just a different way of understanding science. Now, in the African spiritual understanding, it's based upon empiricism. It's, we do observe and make observations about what we observe. There's also the idea of the material. There's a material that in the material world, everything has a life force. So whether it's a rock or a tree or some other object, all objects, whatever, not just humans, but all objects have a life force. And so Europeans misread this as pagan, as worshiping idols. But the idea is that there's a life force in the tree. We're not praying to the tree, we're praying to the force in the tree, right? And then lastly, this energy is concentrated in the basic elements. So earth, wind, fire, water, etc. And so because it's so important in those basic elements, we give these elements human characteristics or traits because they're important. So in Ghana, the earth is called a saseya and is associated with a woman, and the wind is Oya in Yoruba, in Ifa, and so on and so forth. In water, for example, you have Mami Wata, you have Yemenya, you have Oshun. These are water goddesses, and so we deify those entities that are concentrated in the basic elements. And so I'm arguing these are all scientific ideas.
I'm very sorry to interrupt you, Brother Shabazz. If you maybe could make your concluding remarks, because we've run out of time. Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, so these are scientific ideas that have been subjugated by white supremacy. I'm arguing that we need to go back to those and re-examine them and understand the science that undergirds. All right. So in conclusion, I want to make the point that I want to just give a few suggestions. How do we turn this thing around? How do we turn this thing back on its right side up, where Africans are thriving, moving forward, advancing, and defeating white supremacy? I have a few suggestions. Number one, stop citing white people. Before you cite a white person, think to yourself, is there an African who has said something, or what were Africans thinking at the time this European was thinking? And try to find a way to cite Africans, and in that way we propagate African thinking, and we start to promote the idea that Africans also have theory, Africans understand the social world, Africans have their own understanding of science, right? So we have to stop citing white people, stop cite African people. Take inventory of all that we know as scholars, as human beings, as Africans. Take stock of all that we know that we take for granted, because a lot of that is actually Eurocentric. And I'll just mention one quickly before I sign off on this. For example, for African people, I'm arguing that there was no individual in the Western sense of the term. In other words, European individual is a sovereign, thinking, acting person, but for Africans that was never the case. The individual was never sovereign. Your body could be taken over by gods, by spirits, by ancestors. Your body could be a vessel for the spirit world to communicate things to this world. So there's no such thing as a sovereign individual. So what I'm suggesting that we do is think about what it means to normalize the idea of a sovereign individual as opposed to the African idea of the body as a vessel for spiritual beings. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bjorn Shabazz, for that very wonderful presentation. So now we're moving to the questions. I'm sure we're all eager to ask our guests questions. So the floor is now open. You can raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask questions. Okay, I'll go first then, since people are still thinking. My question to the guests is about a quote. David Cameron in the UK, it was Prime Minister like 7 years ago. He said that multiculturalism has failed, and people need to integrate and so forth. So my question to you, why is it that on one hand, I'm taking the case of the UK, but it might also apply to the US, countries recognize that diversity built the country, and at some point you said that multiculturalism has failed, people need to do this and that. So is it that the West is going backwards, and what do you think are the causes of that? Why that's kind of attitude now?
Well, I think I'll go first. There are a few things. One is that, in fact, there was a report out just today or yesterday saying that the world is becoming increasingly African and less European. And the point of it is what they're talking about is reproduction. Europeans are below the reproduction rate to perpetuate European people. So you have to produce 2.1 people on average to reproduce yourself. And Europeans are currently below that average. And so I think there's an anxiety. And there's a book on this, I think it goes back, I think it was published in the 1970s called The Birth Dearth. I believe the author is Waterman or something like that. And The Birth Dearth is talking about this problem, right? So Europeans for years now have been concerned about being sort of overrun by people who don't look like them. And so there's that. There's also, but I did want to know, at least in the US case, I wanted to know, to give a word of caution. It's also true that diversity in the US at least, and I think this is where the idea sort of has, the US idea about diversity has influenced other parts of the world, but diversity was actually a distraction away from, or a strategy used by whites to undermine social justice for Black people. And so there was a famous case in the US where a white person sued a medical school for reverse discrimination because they had slots reserved for African-American students. And there was a lawsuit, and it went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that, okay, you can't have these slots reserved for Black people, i.e. affirmative action, but you can do, quote unquote, diversity, right? So diversity became the white liberal response to Black people demanding restorative justice. And now, and the problem with that is that diversity can mean anything. So whereas civil rights was something specific about remedying an issue that affected Black people, diversity is used for all kinds of things. It's used for transgender people. It's used for people who have physical handicaps. It's used for women, everything. And it allows white people, white Americans, white liberals to appear to be doing something, but it always puts the interest of Black people at the bottom. So I wanted to add that diversity was actually, at least historically in the United States, a way of subverting social justice for Black people. Now, I'm not opposed to multiculturalism. I think ultimately it's important, or it's necessary, it's inevitable that we have a world where, you know, people of different cultures can respect each other and learn from each other and live together. But the reality is that world is not here. That people of African descent are subordinate. And I'm not sure that the liberal idea of diversity or multiculturalism gets to the specific problem of white supremacy and Black subordination. To get to that problem, you have to be very specific about remedies that address the problems of Black or African people. And multiculturalism and diversity doesn't do that, in my view.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if Dr. Freter has any comment with regard to that. You are unmuted, sorry.
Yeah, I was not allowed to unmute myself. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to. So I'm not sure if I fully understood the direction of the question that you were going. Would you be so kind to rephrase that?
Yeah, sure. It's about the fact that on one hand, I'm also talking about the case of the UK, when it is recognized that diversity built the country.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we had our Prime Minister, David Cameron, who say multiculturalism has failed. It's that kind of opposition. So why that change in narrative or rhetoric?
So your question is more or less if this project of multiculturalism has to be regarded as a failed one or not?
Yes. Yeah. No, in your view, yeah.
Yeah, that's of course a difficult question. I'm not sure if I'm authorized or qualified to answer that, but if I would try to give my take on this, I don't think that we know if the project of multiculturalism has failed, because I'm not really sure if we have tried honestly to live multiculturally, because multiculturalism to a large degree, as you all know much better than I do as a white person, is very often has very often to do with the fact of it's of course the question is of course what that project aims to. So if it aims to living together, or if it aims to living next to each other while ignoring each other, probably the latter one has worked to a certain degree. But I'm not sure if the first one has worked, because there's a couple of things that always bug me when discussion comes to multiculturalism, and I especially see that when it comes to attempts to in the interreligious debate, because in the interreligious debate I find very often attempts to point out that we're basically the same. And as much as I would argue that we're, with regards to being human beings, we're basically the same, it's a pretty big difference if you consider yourself to be created by this God, or to live according to this God's law or to that God's law. So I think to a certain degree, we should probably also try to figure out if there's a way to live together while taking into account our differences without adding normative hierarchies to these differences. So I don't think that the last word has been spoken with regards to multiculturalism as a project in that sense, because I don't think that we have that enough attempts have been undertaken to try to figure out if it's possible to find out a way to take seriously the other person in the way that that other person is different, without inferiorizing the other person or superiorizing yourself. Somebody was so graciously to make note of this idea of additive ethics that I try to I haven't worked it out still, but I made a remark to that in a paper I've written, and this sort of goes into that direction, that we should stop talking in hierarchical, that we need to stop thinking in these hierarchies, that we can sort of understand that what is dear to my heart, what is the matter of my heart, does not necessarily materially has to be identical to that which is the matter of the heart of another person, but that the formal structure can be identical, so that I can take my fellow human being seriously in the way that that fellow human being also has a matter of the heart, but not in the sense that that person has the same matter of my heart. And so by doing that, I would probably avoid forcing myself to change that other person, and it would give that other person the chance of being taken seriously by me without fearing that I want to change that person. And I know that that will produce millions of practical problems, but that should not be the reason that holds us back from attempting to working with each other. But of course, I know that there's a certain factual history that has happened before. And I know that that history, of course, does not produce a situation where, if I may say so, Black people have any reason to trust white people, because the betrayal from the white side has been so deep that we do not simply have a situation in which we can just sit down and say, let's start again. Because if we start again, it basically means nothing else but let's forget about all the horrible things my people have done, and you just forget about all the horrible things that have been done to you. That seems a bit weird. So I would say, this is why I always argue for this project of desupperiorization, is we white people, as complicated, as difficult as that is to say that, because it is such a volatile entity. What am I referring to? But I think there's a certain sense in which we can understand that we white people need at first to become dialogical or polylogical partners by pointing out that we understood that the times did not change for us because Black people protested so much that we finally said, okay, we got to settle them down, we got to calm them down, but by understanding what we did is wrong. And I like to compare that to a thief in a house. And if that thief in the house realizes it's not right what I'm doing, I need to put the things back and leave. That is a completely different situation than a thief running away because he hears or that person hears a police siren. And that is what happened with white people. They heard there is trouble coming, so we better do something. But that means that when the trouble is gone, there's a good chance we're going to do the same thing again. So I think before we are even at a new testing stage for whatever multiculturalism might be, we just gotta get we gotta live with the conscience for real that we already pretend to have, because I don't think that we really have it, and I don't think that we really live according to the moral values that we pretend that we are adhering to. So that would be sort of my take on it.
Okay, thank you very much. After we have a lot of questions there from the chat. So I'll start with Dr. Yvette, please, and I'll go to Bjorn. Yeah, if you could unmute yourself, please. Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, I think I just wanted to speak to the issue of multiculturalism because I was trained in the multicultural era here in the United States. And, you know, it's really sad when you read the literature from the 90s. It is exactly what we're producing again in this decade. It's just, we call it diversity. We change the catchphrases for multiculturalism. And I would say that it is, as Bjorn says, that multiculturalism hasn't worked because it hasn't, supremacy hasn't been unwanted. even with the white liberals, there's no giving up of privilege. And so it's wishful thinking. And so I think it's as Ibram X. Kendi talked about, there's this idea of there are segregationists that are, actively racist. And then there's anti-racism, which is, the acceptance of people as true equals. I think a lot of the work of multiculturalism was subsumed and became the work that of assimilation. So instead of a pure acceptance of equal and egalitarian cultures as multiculturalism, it basically became sort of this idea of a tolerating and a very rudimentary knowledge of the other. And there was not that equality, and that's why it hasn't worked. And it will continue. This diversity training is not going to work until we dismantle systemic racism, because we keep treating it like it is personal racism. Thank you.
Can I just mention briefly that we've moved in the U.S. from now, the buzzword now is inclusion, and so we've gone from diversity and multiculturalism to inclusion.
Sorry, that was the. Not sure if that was it now. So there is another question from Abiodun.
From Uti. There's a question from Uti.
Yeah, I'll come back to Uti. I just following the order, Abiodun has already raised quite a long time. Okay, Abiodun.
Abiodun, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Shabazz and Dr. Bjorn. I am directing my question to Dr. Freter, Dr. Bjorn, but definitely the angle in which I'm directing my question would also require Dr. Shabazz to perhaps make a contribution. Now, from the idea of white supremacists presented by Dr. Bjorn, what I see in the presentation, and of course that is also it has implications in Dr. Shabazz's presentation as well, that we are trying to draw the legacy and perhaps the liability of the Enlightenment age. That is for Dr. Bjorn, and for Dr. Shabazz, perhaps the legacy and the liability of the colonial age. What we have oftentimes seen or perhaps read in papers is the legacy of the Enlightenment age. And I think I read in one of Dr. Freter's works about the Enlightenment age and some of their liabilities. Now, I just want it to be clearly spelled out. What are the liabilities of the Enlightenment age that have sponsored this white supremacist agenda, such that we are much, we are at loggerheads trying to understand how to deal with this idea of superiorization. And of course, the same question directed to Dr. Shabazz, talking about the colonial age. Thank you so much for bringing to our understanding some of the myths of race, the myths of African culture, and the myths of science. The burden of trying to deal with this myth now, does it mean that the burden is on the Africans or perhaps the West? Because I think you specifically made it clear that propaganda is responsible for perhaps perpetrating that myth. So who owes that burden to maybe undo those propaganda, is it for the Africans or for the West, to try as much as possible to come down to understand the Africans the way they have? Thank you.
Okay, I don't know who wants to go first, Brother Shabazz or, okay.
I'm so sorry, Abiodun. I had some interference there, some audio interference. I think that the main of the question was directed to me. Can you probably help me say that again?
Yeah, thank you. Let me quickly do that. I was just asking about the liability of the Enlightenment age that has sponsored the idea of superiority of the whites. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's indeed a topic that is fairly important to me, because I think that the Enlightenment, so that period roughly within the 18th century, especially in Europe and North America, has a lot to do with the situation that we're today in. And I do indeed hold these thinkers responsible to a certain degree what has happened today, because I think that thinkers, as I mentioned, like Kant and Hume and Voltaire and Jefferson, are responsible for pulling or for establishing that magical trick of being a moral authority while being while practically working against that that posited morality posited by themselves. So most important, the most important political document is probably Declaration of Independence, or the idea that all men are created equal, which is apparently not what Jefferson had in mind. But the interesting question is, why did he phrase it like that? Why didn't he not phrase it in the white supremacist way it was meant? I am not sure why that is the case, but what I think one can trace down is that this idea of being a white supremacist while looking like someone who considers himself to be inclusive of all the people, that there must be some attraction to that also Thomas Jefferson could not resist. And I think it has to do with that fact that this rhetoric and this way of thinking was established in the Enlightenment. I think that it is something that the Western thought build a tradition upon this that is still valid today. I think this is what's still happening today when president after president in the United States announces that there should be inclusivity and that there should be that white supremacy will be fought. And again, we find that all these systemic white supremacist problems are not actually grabbed by their roots. And especially, I've said it before, in this context, that if you go outside here in Tennessee, white supremacy is not something that is very well hidden. So you see people are walking around in t-shirts or with bumper stickers being clearly white supremacists, but whenever you engage with a person like this, everybody insists that they would never be racist and that there is nothing in them that is white supremacist. Or just remember what I cited from Donald Trump when he says that he's the least racist person in the world. And I think the Enlightenment thinkers are also materially responsible for bringing up a couple of very strange ideas about non-white people, but they are definitely responsible for the mess that we're today in by establishing a way of thought that allows you to consider yourself to be the moral authority, while at the same time breaking with these moral rules and these moral foundations whenever there's something that you want to have. Whenever the United States finds something in the world that they want to have, they will invent a reason why it is necessary for the greater good of the world to take it. And then there was a rhetorical shift, definitely with Donald Trump, who simply claimed by virtue of its own the superiority of the country, you can take it. But at the same time, he tried to maintain this idea that there's that they are amongst equals. It's this strange situation of a primus inter pares, the strange idea of the Enlightenment addressing all human beings, while it is actually a fairly exclusive and elitist undertaking. And I think that is still the case until today.
Thank you very much. I don't know if Brother Shabazz, any comments to that?
Yeah, I concur with most of that. I would add to, we probably should think about the Haitian Revolution, right? So the Haitian Revolution is happening on the heels of the French Enlightenment, and sort of taking on these ideas and putting them to work. You know, if this is what we believe about humankind and justice and fairness and all of that, then why are we enslaved, right? And so they use those ideas to challenge white supremacy in what we now call Haiti. So from 1791 to 1804, Haitian Africans engaged in a revolution, in some part invoking Enlightenment ideas, but also fundamentally invoking principles of voodoo, right? So on the foundation of voodoo, in fact, the revolution was set off by voodoo. So on a foundation of voodoo, they did something that hasn't been repeated. You know, enslaved Africans overturning a system that has subjugated them, overturning slavery and setting up their own republic. That's unprecedented, and they did it on a foundation of voodoo. And so my take is that, you know, yes, it's obvious that those Enlightenment thinkers are responsible for a lot of the mess that we're in, but we Africans are the only ones who can free ourselves. We can't wait around for white people to say, oh, gee, I'm sorry for what we did back then. Let us try and fix it. We'll be waiting another 500 years. Only Africans can fix the mess that we're in. And the only way that we can fix it, I believe, is addressing how the Enlightenment has subjugated organic, indigenous African knowledge, African science. Part of that will require, now for me, I think we have to, in an ideal world, well, I think we'd have to really take stock of Christianity and Islam and re-embrace African traditional religion, right? Not that we take it whole cloth, as Malana Karenga says, who's an Afrocentric thinker in the US, in Los Angeles, we take the best of those traditions and move forward. Sankofa has the same sort of idea, going back to the past, right, to move forward. We don't take everything whole cloth from the past. We take the best of those traditions, of our spirituality, of our sacred systems to propel us forward. But I think fundamentally, if we don't address, you know, subjugated knowledge and freeing that knowledge up to reckoning with the world and thinking ourselves out of this problem, and we're still dependent upon European ideas, right? So until we do those things as Africans, you know, we can wait all day for Europeans to apologize and feel sorry and say that they're wrong for that. Of course they're wrong for that, but it's going to be on us to have the courage to think out of the box, have the courage to believe in ourselves and to believe in our own systems, that we can free ourselves using our own ideas, using our own experiences, using our own concepts to do so.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a question in the chat, but I sent you to both, to Dr. Freter and Brother Shabazz, just so you have it in front of you, but I'll read it for the audience as well. So it's come from Uti. Could you please speak more about the way that European rationality and its attendant subject, object, observe binary positions are different from subjectivity and ways of being in the world as conceived in African cultures? Would you say these perspectives linked to and possibly explain questions of racial hierarchies and what scholars have called subalternity and superalternity? It's a bit long, but I've sent that to you in the chat just so you can read. I don't know if
she wants to speak to it. She wants to speak to it.
Oh,
okay.
She wants to comment on it. Yes.
Yeah. Hello.
Yeah. Uti, if you can just be brief, please, because we just running out of time. Please, it can be
yes, very, very. The question itself has been asked. I just want to contextualize it a little bit so you understand where I'm coming from. And it's this what Brother Shabazz has just spoken about, subjugated knowledge, and then the legacy of the Enlightenment that Professor Freter talked about, the sleight of hand that enables some people to calibrate moral authority by this double shuffle, when now I am the moral authority, and then no matter what I do, I can still remain the moral authority. So my question is, when we're talking about these kinds of positionalities, how can we go back to definitions? So you say subjugated knowledge as a way out, as a way of redefining. How can we go back to the what definitions about the question I asked? You know, subject, object, observer, observed. How are those different in African cultures, and how do those distinctions enable us to begin to counteract these ways of seeing and being seen And if so, how can that help us, with these conversations about race? But I ask this because most of the time, people talk about African knowledge systems and subjugated knowledges, but don't start with definitions. So I'm wondering how those kinds of more rooted ways of engagement can help. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's, I mean, that's of course a big question. And I'm not sure if I'm entitled to speak to all of it. I think I can only speak for the white voice. And that is not only because I'm a white person, it is also because something that was again and again strange to me while getting deeper into the research. It is that the fact that we find a tremendous amount of analysis of the situation we're today in done by those people, if I may so, who were suppressed or who are continued to be suppressed. We have a tremendous amount of scholarship by these people analyzing their own and analyzing their own situation and analyzing the mindset of those who have oppressed them. What we do lack, and this is why I like to put out this call for super-altern or superhuman studies, what we lack is a proper evaluation of the mindset by those who have subjugated themselves. Because what I think has not been properly understood by me and my people, if I may say so, is why did we do that? And why would we not do it again if we are given the chance? And why are we continue to do that in hiding? And I think this is sort of the reason why I am not sure if I'm entitled at all to speak on the differences of the African mindset, if I may summarize your question like that, and of the Western mindset, because I don't think that I have a proper understanding of the African mindset, because I am not sure if I, as having been trained and having so many of these prejudices against my will still in my head that I have to overcome, I'm not sure if I am able to understand that mindset in a proper way. And I'm also not able if it is relevant how I understand it. What I think is I need to learn it by studying texts written by people who understood it. And that I could sort of summarize, but I don't think that would be, I'm not sure how relevant that would be. So I'm pretty sure that is something where Brother Shabazz could talk about. But what I can do is very briefly just comment that we need to understand, and I'm sorry, this is a bit boring because it's pretty much the same position I stated before. What we need to do is to desuperiorize our own understanding. We need to truly understand that we're a part of humanity and not the fulfillment of humanity. And how to practice that is very difficult. At the moment, I'm more concerned with how to address these issues within the academic situation, so especially within training young students, young philosophers, and how to make sure that they are educated about, for example, the Enlightenment in its entirety, and not only in its glorious moral ideas, but also in all these strange anti-moral or self-contradictory dissonances that we can find there. So what we need to do is to understand that they are differences. And we need, in a second step, to understand that two things being different from each other does not in no way imply that one of these things is better. So if I find something that is different, there is no need to normatively hierarchize these two things and figure out if I'm better or the other thing is better. And there's in consequence no need to tell to the other person, well, you need to change so that you become me. But we need to develop a way to fully appreciate the otherness without connecting it to inferiority. And I think that is so complicated and such a massive project for the Western world, because it's a project that we pretty much have denied to do for at least 250 to 300 years. Of course, a lot of white colleagues have done it, but in the width, like on a social, on a societal level, it has not been done. And I think that would be the very first step. And then after we having done that, I think then we probably end up at a situation where we are then able to address Uti's actual question.
Thank you very much, Brother Shabazz.
Yeah, I'm going to violate my own rule here inside of European, but he's actually pretty good. Charles Peale is an anthropologist at Harvard, not Harvard, Duke. He has a book called Remotely Global that I think addresses in an interesting way Uti's question about an African worldview versus a European worldview, and sort of how the African worldview, which is basically about relatedness. So Europeans have basically have universalized a worldview that is materialistic, it focuses on that foregrounds materialism, individuals, detached human beings, that's objective, objectivity, etc. The African worldview, and I should preface by saying that this may sound romantic, and in European Western graduate school, you learn that romanticizing Africa is bad. I'm here to tell you that romanticizing Africa is necessary and good. We better do a lot of romanticizing. And in fact, no nation on the planet has done more romanticizing than the United States, right? Our history, our culture, or their culture, this culture is steeped in romanticism. Our kids, we pledge allegiance to the flag, the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, with liberty. I don't even remember the words of it, but it's all about, this propaganda about how wonderful America is. What's the other one called? I'm blinking out. But yeah, so my point is that American romanticism is just backed by power, right? Backed by weapons, backed by ideology, backed by propaganda. If we're going to get this thing right as African people, we better get our romantic game together and weaponize it. So we need to start romanticizing our culture, right? And so part of that culture is about, I think, worldview is about relatedness. So in the African worldview, there was a focus on connecting things, that things were connected. The spirit world was connected to the material world, and the aim was to balance, to maintain a balance. You do rituals to maintain balance between the sacred and the material world. You're also connected to people, right? There's an idea in anthropology called wealth and people. The idea that Africans value more your relationships than material wealth. Not that material wealth isn't important, but who you're related to, how many connections you have, how many people come to your funeral, how many people come to your funeral, is much more important than materialism, because when you die, you go to the spirit world, but you don't have any material things. So it's all about connecting. And so I think, in answer to Uti's question, if we could get back to and think deeply about the implications of relatedness and connection, and the implications of that to Africans in contemporary times. I might add too that even in science, Western science, they're actually looking in that direction now. If we look at quantum physics, right? They're now in quantum physics, and this is a principle that was first discovered or described by, I believe, Albert Einstein, and he called it spooky movement at a distance. And the idea is that these elemental particles, the smallest particles of physical matter, electrons, protons, etc. If you create electrons in the same space and then separate them by even a galaxy, right? And then you manipulate one of the electrons, that electron on the other side of the galaxy will also be manipulated. And so there's some sort of thing that connects them that contemporary physics can't explain. The explanation lies in for Europeans in quantum physics. But for Africans, that's not unusual at all. Africans know that you don't have to be next to something to manipulate it. And so yeah, so my point being is that these ideas are already rooted in what we do as African people, what we did in African society in terms of spirituality, about relatedness, about connectedness. And if we can, sort of think deeply on those principles, then I think we could go, it would be a starting point for getting us out of this individualistic, materialistic, capitalistic mess that we find ourselves in currently.
Okay, thank you very much. So, I mean, there are a lot of things being said in the chat, but if I miss your question in the chat, I'll advise you just to speak because there's a lot of things going on. I'm sorry to follow up all of that. But we have a question from Khadija, and then I'll take the question for Joseph. And I think we will start rounding up because we went over. I know it's a very interesting topic, and and apologies to our guests for taking this long. Okay, Khadija, if you could be brief in asking your question, please. Khadija. I'm pressing ask you on why. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Khadija.
Yeah, so good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So this is Khadija Shirgi, a doctoral scholar specialized in African studies from Algiers. My intervention in here is not really a question, but it's a comment, a complimentary comment to Dr. Shabazz's presentation, which I like so much. So speaking about propaganda, and we know that the race question originally started with the propaganda. If we are to recall all of those Enlightenment mythologies which were propagated through either historiography or literary representation, and the world was introduced with a kind of historical picture about the African man with little connection to what was really going on the continent. And I think the print culture also participated so much in propagating this picture. So in here, if one really answer I'm speaking from the perspective of an African, of a North African specifically. Why? Because our history is connected to Sub-Saharan Africa as it is connected to the Mediterranean context, to the Middle Eastern context, to the Southern European context. So it is really a very complex perspective to speak from. But I think, and this applies also to Algeria, is that a way of the best answer to answer back to this very long rhetoric of misrepresentation and of the race question is through reconstruction more than propaganda. Why? Because propaganda speaks about data, and now who owns data owns the world. And we know very well that different platforms, whether Twitter, Facebook, or many other forms of social media, are really manipulated, and we know this very well. We are made to sympathize with those we want to be. We are kind of implicitly or indirectly wanted to sympathize with. And I think, for example, if we relate to the Palestinian cause recently, where many accounts, whether on Twitter, on Facebook, were closed off. Why? Because the data is being manipulated. So, and this also relates to the Uyghur case, relates to many other cases in the world, where even the genocides, some are known and others are not known. Why? Because we are made to believe what we want to believe. We are made to sympathize with what we want to sympathize. So I think propaganda is not enough. That we have reached a stage where reconstruction is a very necessary step. Reconstruction through our history departments, through our academia circles, through the knowledge production centers here in Africa, through who is willing really to take action and who is not willing to take action. How many history departments we have in Africa that need to be decolonized? In Algeria, for example, we have many or much of our intellectual history is being produced outside the border of the of the Algerian country. Many, and this applies to many other departments also, that need to be decolonized. That's why in here, reconstruction goes beyond propaganda. So propaganda is romanticizes with what we have. A kind of brings a picture or draws a picture about what we have. But if we don't move to the action of reconstruction, I don't think that we are moving anywhere. Reconstruction through intercontinental connection. And I think it's very hard for an African person from the North African region to move even to the heart of Africa or to South Africa without going through a very, very, very long process of action. So we're not allowed to move smoothly in here. So, and I think maybe I am recalling the ideas of the very first African presidents like Jomo Kenyatta, like Kwame Nkrumah, like maybe Petrus Lumumba, many other nationalists who thought of saving the African continent according to the African terms. But I think with time and with the years, just recently we lost such an aspiration because not enough action is being done in here. So I think we need to go from propaganda or move beyond it into a very active reconstruction. But this needs a readiness on the part of the different people who claim to be African, who claim to be supportive, either of the race question or of many other kind of narratives on the continent. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks much for your comments. I don't know if Dr. Freter or Shabazz want to respond to that comment or anything to add. If not, I will take the last question because we are okay. So the last question was from Joseph, just asking about political leadership in Africa. Whether could you please share your thoughts on leadership in Africa, which seem to be working in tandem with non-African forces to subject the Africans? So, and also I would like to ask anyone who want to add any other questions, so we can just round out because we went over the time. Is there any other comments, questions?
Yeah, the question I want to ask has to do with the impact of some people feeling that they are inferior and some people making them to feel that way on daily life and on how police react towards certain people and on how the general populace behave towards others. My own question and comment has much to do with this idea of who is superior or who is inferior goes beyond, or whether we are all equal, goes beyond just the intellectual quest, but to the grassroots and to how people talk and how some people feel some things are right and some things are wrong. We have the recent case in US of a white dude that called someone a monkey and everything, and then the police did not react the way they were even securing his door from the other people. And then all they can do is go to the TV like a star and say that, I'm sorry, I've done that. And many people have been saying that. The question is this: when someone like myself, maybe in the UK, and I express some of the attitude that people behave that makes you feel, they act towards you as if you're inferior. Some people tell you, oh, I'm sorry you feel that way. They push it back at you. So I'm just trying to look at if the speakers could actually give some tips on how to handle, day-to-day affairs, because we are all human beings apart from books that we have all referenced. Day-to-day affairs, in handling this, pressure, psychological pressure. The same thing for people at home. They will ask the fundamental question: why do we not think we are inferior when everything we have to study to make our society better is from there? And so they even know it's already ingrained. So for me, I just feel from people who are here, if you can type in the chat or the speakers, help us out in our day-to-day affairs. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to unmute. Thank you, Augustine. So I'm going to unmute both our guests so they can address these the comments from Khadija, who talked about reconstruction, and also the question from Joseph, who talked about political leadership in Africa. That is to address its subaltern state, and also the comment from Augustine. So those three, if you can address them in your concluding remarks, please. Yeah, I don't know if Dr. Freter.
I don't think Reconstruction is an idea that's, or propaganda and Reconstruction, mutually exclusive ideas. One requires the other. If you're gonna, so Khadija was sort of implying that Reconstruction is about action, and propaganda is just, it's about words. And she also used the word data, but propaganda is really, it could be anything that is used to promote an ideology as normative. And what I focused on in my talk primarily was I put a lot of emphasis on religion, how religion is used ideologically to promote the idea of white supremacy and Black inferiority. So it's not just data, right? It's about Africans reclaiming, reasserting, and also, you know, brushing up and cleaning up whenever it's necessary their own indigenous organic principles. And many of those principles are about the sacred, right? So that's not just data, and that's not just WhatsApp or Twitter. That's something organic that comes from us as African people, and that's propaganda. So that's one thing. It's not just about data or media. Propaganda can be many different things. And if you're going to reconstruct something, you have to have ideas. What is on what principles are you going to reconstruct? Right? You have to have ideology. You have to have principles. You have to be able to dream. You have to be able to imagine something beyond your reality. And all of that is about I'm arguing propaganda. So I think these are complementary ideas. They don't have to be antagonistic. But I like the idea of reconstruction. It's necessary. I agree with that. As far as inferior and superior, the only way I think to combat that, you know, this idea of feeling inferior is for people, individuals like us who are informed. We have to create institutions that challenge white supremacy, right? We have to build up institutions, organize study groups, political education. There are all kinds of methods we can use. And we are obligated to do that, to do the work necessary to build up counter institutions, counter ideas, counter principles that challenge the normative ideas of white supremacy. So that work is on us. And we have the obligation to do that work, I think. And it's not going to really change significantly until we do the work. So that's just going to be, you know, we have to roll up our sleeves and just get busy. That's all we can do to respond to that. You know, as an educator, I encounter these things all the time. And so I do that work in the classroom and in my community, but we just have to be able to, you know, try to scale those things up as best we can and to be as impactful as we can. So it's a tall order because, you know, whether you're in Nigeria or in South Africa or in Egypt and you're a Black person in Brazil, it doesn't matter where you are, you have been influenced to some degree by white supremacists or even Arab supremacy ideas that subjugate African knowledge. And so until we built up counter knowledge in Afrocentric institutions, it'll be hard to challenge those things. There was one more comment that I might have missed. So that's all I have for now. I think there was one more comment, I might have missed it though.
All right. Yeah, I'll try to keep it also very brief. So, of course, thank you, Kajika, for your comments. I just leave it to that. If I'm happy to discuss it, maybe outside the webinar in emails. That was very interesting points. Then, with regards to the leadership, I think the main issue, and again, I have to repeat myself, the main issue here when it comes to leadership in Africa and when it comes to the European or Western involvement with Africa is a critical reevaluation of the way we treat Africa, because simply the point of inventing something that is called development politics, which opens up the binary of the developed and the not yet developed or the undevelopable, disregards on the one hand that where we are is not necessarily where other people want to end up. So there's no one-way street to the development that we are. So we need to stop recommending ourselves to the rest of the world. And we also need to stop all the neo-colonial ways in which the Western world harasses Africa. If the Western world is serious about Africa letting develop, well, then we should probably stop bringing our trash there and throwing it on Nigerian dumpsters whenever we feel that we need a new phone. So I think it's pretty straightforward. If the Western world will take its values, its very own values seriously, that would be very helpful, I think, for the situation of those who are still dominated, but they are no longer dominated by a colonial officer, but by the alleged natural fact of the market. And the last question, which is of course really breaking my heart, by Augustine, what to do about this continuous harassment by white supremacists. I mean, that is pretty much why I talk about this. And it was reflected upon in the chat why I'm addressing these issues, even though they are known, but they are factually not known. Because I, as a white guy, I know how white people speak when they think they can speak freely. And they do not know, or they don't want to know. So the thing that I devoted myself to personally, but also as a scholar, is this project of desupperiorization, or however you want to call it, this way of bringing ideas, facts, thoughts, whatever is into the life of those who consider themselves not supremacists because they think by virtue of nature they are just where they are, and it would be theft to take it away from them. And I try to make them reflect on the fact that just because you didn't steal it, but your grandfather stole it, it's still theft. And it's still not yours. And if you think that it is yours just because it was a long time yours, you're making a mistake, and you're contradicting yourself with regards to your very own moral principles. And I'm pretty sure, or I have experienced it myself, whenever I approach a white supremacist while being actively white supremacist, there's only one thing that happens, unless it is like a full hardcore Nazi. That person will tell you that it is not white supremacist, and that person will try to avoid any sort of confrontation that makes that person personally responsible. They will try to shift the discussion from I am not a white supremacist, and how can it be my fault that I was born into privilege? And I think the only thing that I can do as a white scholar is, well, you are not responsible for being born in a privileged situation, but you're responsible for staying in a privileged situation. And that's the thing that I can do as a white scholar. But I cannot comprehend how it must feel, because I have not experienced it a single time in my life, for being talked down to because of the color of my skin. So I cannot speak to that. I wish I could, because it would probably help me to do better work, but I have to hold myself back here. I don't know how that is. So as heartbreaking as it is that my people make my brother Augustine ask these questions, I honestly have only very limited insight how to answer that question. But you can trust me that I try to influence this mindset as much as I can. So that's unfortunately the sad and certainly not very satisfying answer I have to give to that.
Could I just add something briefly to that? I just wanted to note that, U.S. activists have, our position has been that it's really less, we don't diminish those individual interactions, but the real problem is structural. And if we attack those structural problems, how white supremacy is embedded in structures and institutions, then what these individuals do will be less impactful. And so that's been our emphasis. Now, I did want to mention, as far as African leaders go, that's pretty straightforward. African leaders are puppets. There's no way around it. And they're puppets because any African leader who tried to challenge the status quo was smeared or jailed or exiled or killed by the West. That's pretty clear. And so now in that vacuum has come our current crop of African leaders. So they're puppets, and every African nation requires loans from their former colonial masters to even form a government. So we're not even, African nations are they're independent but in flag only. So you have flag independence. And so that's really the challenge. And the only way that's going to change, really, I think, is at the grassroots. We have to mobilize, continue to mobilize as we've been doing at the grassroots level. And I'm a Pan-Africanist, so I have to say, we have to unite. We have to do what we can to unite our people across borders, across continents, and in that way, they can undermine a small nation state called Ghana, or even a larger nation state called Nigeria. But it's hard to undermine 1.5 billion people, Black people, African people who are united. Now, we can't get 1.5 billion Black people on the same page. But if we could get a fraction of 1.5 billion on the same page, we could do a lot of damage. And so let's unite. Let's challenge the institutions. Let's not get depressed. Let's not get demoralized. Let's do something. Let's, as Khadija said, let's get to work. Let's get busy.
Thank you so much, Brother Shabazz. On that note, I think we'll end this webinar. We are very, very grateful for Brother Shabazz and Dr. Freter taking your time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. And we know it's earlier in the US compared to us here. So we're very, very grateful for your thought and insightful presentations, and also for the participants who took time to be with us today. So we're very happy and grateful. I'm just sharing our next webinar quickly. Feel free to register, and also if you are not yet one of our members, feel free to join us. You can Google African Social Network, and then you can also join us. So yes, and then we wish you all have a nice weekend with your friends and family. Thank you so much again. Thank you. Thank you, all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you.
See you.